I'm Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief of USA Today, and this is Capitol Download. We're at the Pentagon with the 23rd Secretary of the Air Force, Deborah Lee James. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Susan.
The battle against the terror group known as Islamic State is being waged mostly by the Air Force, mostly a bombing campaign, since President Obama has ruled out a big deployment of U.S. ground troops. Tell us, how is that going?
Susan, I think we are making very solid progress in the fight against ISIL. We have been doing in the United States Air Force more than 60% of the strikes to date. We've done more than 95% of the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, the vast majority of the mobility, and the vast majority of the tanker, the gassing of the aircraft to keep them flying. And on the ground, of course, ISIS is not waving that flag around quite so openly anymore. So our efforts have succeeded in getting them to change their tactics, techniques. They're going much more underground. And so we need to have strategic patience, though, because this will be the long ball. This will be a fight which will likely take years, and so we just have to keep at it.
Have there been any surprises since this campaign began? Anything that we didn't expect at that point?
Well, the very fact that we have this campaign at this moment is somewhat of a surprise. I think most Americans would agree. We did believe that we would have a bit of a strategic pause in the Middle East as we wound down the combat operations in Afghanistan. So the very fact that we are in this campaign is somewhat surprising.
Are there limits to what we can expect to do with a bombing campaign without having more boots on the ground there?
Well, of course, we are intending to have the boots on the ground in the form of the Iraqi army, the Syrians, and that's what that training effort is all about. So we do view it as a total campaign. Again, heavily air at this moment. The ground will also follow, and it is joint and it is coalition as well.
But we haven't really been able to count on the Iraqi armed forces despite all that training. The Syrian rebels, that's been a very problematic enterprise. Has that created challenges for you in this bombing campaign?
So there have been some setbacks, but there have been some recent advances as well, particularly with respect to the Iraqi army. And so that, just like the bombing campaign and the air campaign generally, it's going to take some time.
The Pentagon confirmed last week that Iran has been conducting airstrikes in eastern Iraq.